grab it and check out. No, it's okay.
Okay, I will. I will. For coming. If you didn't get an agenda, Eileen is passing one around to you. If you didn't sign in, please do that. We want to make sure we have that information. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Danielle Conroy, and I'm the Executive Director for the River Raisin Institute. And to get us started, I would like to ask Pete Lowney, who's one of our board members, to say a few words.
Good evening. I want to add my welcome to having you here tonight. Thanks for taking time to come out. We wanted to give you a little bit of an understanding of this project that Danielle and the staff have worked on tirelessly for the last few years with it. This project actually is a state of Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ, funded study. The SS Lapointe Watershed Management Planning Grant is what funded it for us. We wanted to give you an overview of the project tonight, overview of the public opinion survey, and an insight to where we want to go from here. But one of the things that I want to do in my name of this here tonight is give you an introduction to the River Raisin Institute itself. We actually have a mission statement that we try to follow very closely with the projects that we take on, and I'd like to share that with you. The River Raisin Institute is a non-profit organization that sponsors educational works with the goal to respect, nurture, and promote the well-being of all creation. The Institute collaborates with others to promote transformational learning and sustainability community for the 21st century and beyond. We have a few other members here from the River Raisin Board. Larry Belposh in the back. Larry's there. Eileen Hatch is there. Michelle Lavoie here. All board members as well. We have Danielle, who's already mentioned that she's our executive director. From our staff, we overwork and underpay, I'm sure. Sharon Premier and Brittany Santour. And we'd all like to welcome you here tonight. And I want to turn this back over to Danielle.
Thank you, Pete. There's a few more thank yous that I'd like to acknowledge right now as we get started. This project has been a collaboration of a lot of organizations, great partnerships, which is the best way and the most successful way to undertake a project. So these are the organizations that have been a part of the steering committee from the beginning. The River Raisin Institute, of course, we received the fund, the 319 grant. Monroe Conservation District, the Monroe County Health Department, Environmental Health, Monroe County Drain Commission, Monroe County Planning Department, City of Luna Pier, LaSalle Township, Erie Township, Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, and community stakeholders. So we have individuals as well who have been a part of this project from the beginning. And our goal tonight is to share with you what we've done over the last 3 years of this planning project, to go over the conditions that currently exist, the sampling that was done, the environmental testing that was done. We want to answer your questions as well. We know that we have 2 hours, and I know that seems like a long time to sit, but we have refreshments, we have coffee, water, so feel free at any time to have some of the refreshments. Also, we did pass out cards at every table, so as you think of questions, write it down on a card. We're going to collect them throughout the meeting, and we're going to answer as many questions as time permits. In the event that we don't get to all of them, if you put your contact information on that card, we will get back to you as soon as possible if we don't get to your question in the meeting, but we hope to get to all of them. Also, the meeting is being live streamed, so we'll be taking this microphone off and sharing it among the presenters. Matthew Prang is the Director of Instructional Technology for the Monroe County Intermediate School District, and he's doing this for us, and it will be on YouTube, so you can watch this many times after for your educational enhancement. So thank you very much, Matthew. All right, I'm just going to do a quick overview of the project. I wanted to mention, too, that the Watershed Management Plan, Brittany, can you just hold up the book there? It's a little show and tell. This is the Watershed Management Plan with all of the appendices, everything that is part of that plan. This is a hard copy. We also have this on our website. So the information that you're hearing tonight, you can access by going to the website, and we're going to tell you how to do that tonight. So as Pete mentioned, this is a project that was funded from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. It's a 319 non-point source grant. That means it's a grant that's it's looking at non-point sources of pollution in this watershed. It was awarded in 2014, and the areas of interest or the scope of the project, what's included, what are the areas that we looked at, are the SS Lapointe drain, and you have a copy of the watershed map on the back of your agenda. So if you want to make any notes about that, you have the map. So it is the watershed, the SS Lapointe drain, Sulphur Creek, Luna Pier Beach, and Muddy Creek. So SS Lapointe drain is a small orphan watershed, we like that term, and it feeds directly into Lake Erie. It has been one of the contributors to the phosphorus and algae problems that have plagued the Western Lake Erie Basin since the 1990s. The impairments in the watershed, so there are impairments in the watershed, include partial and total body contact. Basically, that's the beach, Luna Pier Beach. So partial and total body contact. Warm water fishery is the second one. And the third one, so there are three, the third one is other indigenous life and wildlife. So those impairments resulted in the state of Michigan establishing a TMDL, which stands for Total Maximum Daily Load. And that's required by, and I'll be corrected if I say anything wrong by the experts over here, but the US EPA requires that a TMDL be established when you're not meeting the water quality standards and the body is impaired. And so that means that only a certain level of E. coli, total phosphorus, sediment, and dissolved oxygen can be in that body of water. It can't exceed a certain limit on a daily basis. So that was established for that watershed. And when it exceeds that, and it is exceeding those, and that's what we worked on to figure out why is that happening and what can we do to change it and to improve it and to get it back within meeting the water quality standards. That was the whole purpose of this project. Just as another interesting note, on November 10th, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality designated the Western Lake Erie Basin as impaired because of the extensive algal blooms, which you are aware of, caused by excessive levels of phosphorus. The impact on the aquatic life and other wildlife, which are designated uses for Lake Erie, under the water quality standards for the state, actually for the federal water standards, required them to do this. Even though Michigan's portion of Lake Erie is very small, so I think it's under 5%, it's very small. The DEQ, by doing this, is communicating the importance and the urgency of concerted action to limit the incidence of severe algal blooms. The goals and objectives are in the document that you can look at. These are the 5 main goals. Develop an approved plan, and the plan would have implementation activities, it would have goals and so on that we'd have to measure. There would be an implementation group, and our implementation group has evolved from their steering committee to what is now the implementation group, and they will oversee the work of the implementation, and they will facilitate the coordination of the different stakeholders. We will work on the priorities that have been identified through this planning project and work to improve and reduce and eliminate the impairments. Facilitate public education involvement is another big part of a plan. So that means that we want to engage the public, we want to educate, inform the public on what the water quality issues are, explain why it's important to them, and explain how they can get involved in solving the problem. And then finally, and this is really important, and it can only happen if you have an approved watershed plan, qualify the watershed for funding to address the problems. So this plan was approved in September of this year. So it is an approved watershed management plan. So this watershed is eligible for funding to address all the elements that are problematic. Just so you know where we are in this chart, I know you can't read it, but there are 6 steps. We are down here on watershed plan document where we are implementing the watershed plan. So those first 4 sections, that's what we've been doing since we began in 2014. Building partnerships, characterizing the watershed, doing testing, finalizing goals, identifying solutions, and writing an implementation plan. So we're now at the step where we're implementing the plan. All right, on your agenda, this just to show you where we are. How am I doing on time, Eileen? Eileen's a timekeeper, so I keep going here so I make sure we have time for everybody. Okay, so I'm at the information education overview. So the information education plan is a part of the watershed plan, and this is just a screen on the right side of this slide is a screenshot of the chart that shows the priority target audiences. So who is this plan for? Who are we addressing the activities for and to? So the I&E is the shortcut. I mean, that's how we talk about it. Information education, or I&E, is to increase public knowledge and awareness of the water quality challenges, to educate stakeholders about the impact of their land use practices, develop partnerships, so we work together across organizations to facilitate activities, create a sense of individual responsibility. So that's important that people take on responsibility for proper use of our water resources, empower our local citizens to implement those practices both by way of education, maybe funding if that's necessary, and then provide opportunities for people to participate in them. So the target groups up here that we have, the priority level, the high priority level, there are 3 groups in that priority: farmers, local government, and residents. So that's the top priority level of audience that we're targeting to work with on implementing. And the I&E plan and the other action plan looked at those target audiences and prioritized so that we make sure that we get the best bang for the buck and investment. The moderate group, the next level, are schools, marina, septic installers, septic haulers, environmental advocacy groups, and I can't read that one. It's too blurry. I can't read it. Anyway. Institutions. Sorry, institutions like churches, other nonprofits, other than the schools. Schools would be institutions too. And then then we have a low priority, and some of the action plans are addressed for the low priority, but the majority of them will be for the high priority and the moderate priority. And the low include lawn care and landscaping, developers, contractors, service groups, and recreational users. One of the ways in which we assessed where people are at in terms of how they think about the water in the watershed, how they think about their own contribution to it or their own understanding of it, was we did a public opinion survey. We did two different surveys. We sent some to farmers, and we sent one survey to farmers, so it was designed for the farming population. We sent another survey to the non-farming residents, property owners, landowners who were not farming residents. So we sent 373 surveys to the non-farming residents, and 205 farmers received the survey. The return rate for the public opinion was 32%. It's not too bad. And it was 29% for the ag survey. The chart shows the different types of residences that participated in the survey. So while 75% of this watershed is zoned agricultural, but only 20% respondents live on a farm. So you can see from the bar to the far right of the slide shows that. Isolated, and most of the public opinion survey respondents are in that category, or urban or development. Isolated would be like rural residents, that's not a farm. Development, housing, subdivision. Urban is obviously a city. Then we asked what people think. This is good news. What do people think about their actions, how they impact water quality? The majority of respondents agree, 76% agree that their actions have an impact on water quality. So that's important and very encouraging. Quality of life in my community depends on good water quality. 80% of the respondents either strongly agreed or agreed with that statement. And then, this is a key one, I'd be willing to change my management practices to improve water quality. And half of the respondents indicated a willingness to change a management practice. About 51% said they would be willing to think about or change their practice. So that was good news. Then we asked, what is your opinion of the impairments in this watershed? And the impairments are across the bottom. So they range from sediment, phosphorus, bacteria, virus, trash and debris, algae, oxygen depletion, aquatic invasive species, habitat alteration harming fish, or nitrogen, which is agriculture only. The most severe problems in the watershed were algae. These are the ones that are circled. So algae was the highest, followed by aquatic invasive species and bacteria and virus. Only 22% responded that phosphorus was a severe problem, suggesting a need for education so that people obviously are not making the connection between too much phosphorus and the algal blooms. Also, there was a high rate of I don't know for oxygen depletion. So that's another area for education. Sources of water pollution, farming. This is the agricultural survey responses. Farming indicated, cohort indicated industry, discharge from industry, sewage treatment plants, and lawn fertilizers as the primary sources of pollution. 51% of the respondents said that soil erosion from farm fields is a moderate to severe problem. So in other words, they were taking responsibility for contributing to the problem. Soil erosion is one of the primary sources of pollution in the watershed, and installation of filter strips or buffers is one of the recommendations that we're making. The public opinion survey, the non-farming responses, the highest ranking sources were excessive use of fertilizers for crop production. That's on the far right, the arrow that's marking that. Followed by discharge from industry and discharge from industry and discharge from sewage treatment plants, and soil erosion from farm fields. The respondents also did claim responsibility or say that excessive use of lawn fertilizer also contributed to the problem. So both cohorts were saying we are contributing to the problem, but they also point to the other groups as contributing more, basically. Septic systems is another area that we looked at. I mean, we didn't look at individual septic systems, but we know that the average life expectancy for a septic system is about 25 years. But that depends on the design, how well it's maintained, if it's maintained at all. 47 of our respondents' septic system, and this is the lower chart, are beyond the natural life expectancy. 47 are at risk for failure simply because they're old. 77% said they do or will do service their system regularly. And 13% did report some sign of failure. Okay, I'm gonna hurry up here. This is just overall consequences of poor quality. Overall, the farmers see better conditions, which means you can just tell, like, they don't have high purple bars, which are severe problems. But if you look in the bottom chart, which is everybody else, their purple bars, which show severe problems, are higher. So it's just kind of a general sense there. Both groups, though, did rate excessive use of algae or excessive aquatic plants or algae as a severe problem, consequence of poor water quality. Practices to improve water quality, only half of the people who responded properly disposed of household waste. So that was a little disappointing. So there's a need for education there. Just over a third said they followed the manufacturer's instructions for applying fertilizer and pesticides, another area for improvement and education. Many survey respondents, if you look at the far right of the slide, don't believe that regular soil testing is relevant for their property, although many, 14% do soil testing. We asked the farmers that participated in the survey, what agricultural practices do they use? We didn't go through all of them, but we asked them about some. And if they use it or not, if they don't, why not? And what are the constraints to using it? So these were the practices that we received responses to. So many of the farmers that responded said that they currently use regular septic system servicing. They use chiseling and subsoiling. So that's the high blue bar, and filter strips. One of the things that we learned when we did the stream walk and when we did the tillage survey, or the DEQ did the tillage survey, and also information from the NRCS, it didn't really correspond exactly with the number here on how many farmers are using filter strips, because we didn't see that percentage when we were out there doing those walks. Because it's showing just, about 40% doing it. We didn't see 40%. And then for the homeowner practices, we asked them, these here, keep yard waste out of roads and ditches, instructions for applying pesticide, phosphate-free fertilizer, properly dispose of pet waste, and protect stream bank with vegetation. One of the things that we found interesting is that the homeowners don't think that they need to protect the stream bank, or that it's not relevant for them, it's not necessary. So they marked it as not relevant, but many non-farm residents reside along a county ditch. So that's an area for education. Then we asked on some of them, and we did more than one, cover crops, and I've just got one more slide after this one. What are the specific constraints? Do you use this? Are you willing to try it? Maybe or no? And the number one constraint, according to the survey results, was cost, for the farmers saying that was the number one constraint, followed by insufficient proof of water quality benefit and lack of equipment. We did the same with rain gardens for the non-farming respondents. This is a screenshot. I'm not going to this because I want to move on, let the next person, so we can stay on the agenda. But this is the information education plan, and there are two sections. There's general awareness and there's taking action. There's an action plan. And across the top, you have various categories, the pollutant, what's the key message, how is that going to get it delivered, who are the partnering organizations, what is the timeline, and how are we going to evaluate if this is working, if we're doing what we're supposed to do, and what the cost is. So we did, that's also in the plan, and same thing for the general awareness. Just a little bit different in terms of the categories, but basically the same thing. All right, so I might be a minute or so over, but I'm going to turn it over to Scott, and we're just, if you want to stretch and get a coffee while I give him the mic, and he pulls up his.
Kind of on the technical side of stuff. I have two parts to the presentation. I'll go through the first part now, and that's basically our assessment work. And that included, let me back up a minute. Danielle did a nice intro to the process. I have been doing this for a while, and I've kind of reduced the watershed management planning process to essentially one bullet point. And DEQ may take up an issue with me, but I really think this is really what we do in watershed management planning is we prioritize problems and we prioritize solutions, right? There's only ever so much money to go around to do things, so you got to prioritize. So you got to come up with your list of things. What's the worst? What's the next? What's after that? And then where are you going to put your money to try and take care of those problems? So that's really what the assessment was about, excuse me, was prioritizing problems, and then in the implementation phase, which is the second part of my presentation, we talk about prioritizing the solutions. Daniela also hit really on the problem, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on this. Essentially, we have three major impairments, water quality impairments. We've got the mouth of Lapointe drain, which is impaired because of excess sedimentation, excess phosphorus, and low dissolved oxygen. So organic or aquatic organisms basically essentially breathe oxygen from the water column. And in the mouth of the Lapointe drain, oxygen levels can get low enough that fish sometimes wouldn't be able to survive in that water. High E. coli bacteria. E. coli bacteria are not necessarily the bacteria that will get you sick. It's an indicator of the potential of other kinds of microorganisms that could get you sick. So it's an indicator that's relatively easy to test for, and it has been shown again and again that there is a relationship. Typically, the more you see those kinds of microorganisms in the water, the higher the chance is that if you actually ingest that water, you'll come down with something. And this impairment is at the beach. As some of you may know, if you're Luna Pier residents or try to use the beach, on occasion the beach does get closed because of high E. coli numbers. And then lastly, Danielle hit on this too. I want to bring it up as well. I think it's partly a contentious issue. I think that DEQ actually took a brave step in listing the western portion of the Lake Erie Basin as impaired. I think, again, we're all familiar with some of the massive algae blooms that have been happening in the lake. It is the most productive fishery in the Great Lakes, so I think that kind of action is warranted with the situation that we find ourselves in today. Again, I guess I don't really need to go through this. This is the goals of the plan. Danielle hit this. Again, we're trying to achieve those lift the impairments for the water quality bodies. And the other aspects of the goals are about, for instance, building capacity for the River Raisin Institute, probably the main nonprofit organization in the watershed, with a goal of improving water quality. That's part of the mission now for this project. And one of the things, I don't know if you hit upon this, but if we were able to lift the impairment on the beach, it would increase the amount of time people could swim. We had discussed the possibility, of potentially doing some kind of additional recreation, finding land in the watershed or just outside the watershed to create a new park. It's just simply an idea. I have kind of come to think of watershed management planning as not just improving water quality, but potentially improving the human experience. You improve that, maybe you get more people who come to Luna Pier, who come to the beach, and so there is an economic connection. I think to say that improving the environment is not consistent with improving the economy, I think is just flat out wrong. And I think it can be shown these days. Okay, so our assessments. We did a couple different assessments. First, we did water quality. So the impairments are created by, if there's a sampling program, like at Luna Pier Beach, Monroe Health Department does regular sampling in the summer. Once those numbers we start to see those exceedances, the exceedances become regular, it can get listed by the DEQ. Other things like the phosphorus exceedances, that came out of regular DEQ sampling. But that's sampling at just one location. So going back to my one bullet point description of watershed management planning, our goal is to try to work back up into the watershed and determine, is there a way for us to say, this area clearly there's more phosphorus being contributed from this area than from this area. Right? So our goal in the assessments is to try to suss out, so to speak, where are the hot spots, if you will, for phosphorus, for sediment, for E. coli. Another interesting thing that we did was we hired, they call them environmental canines, but actually, I don't know if you know about this, but this is, dogs have incredibly sensitive noses. They've been trained to sniff out all kinds of things. And in the last couple of years, dogs have been trained to sniff out indicators, if you will, of human sewage. And I know it sounds crazy, but they can literally differentiate human sewage from other sources of, what do you want to call it? I can't think of a polite term, but you know what, everyone has to go to the bathroom, right? So the dogs have been trained to differentiate the sources of sewage, if you will. And it's really an amazing thing. And we had the dogs out just for a day. That was part of our assessment as well. And I'll describe a little bit of the results as I go. We did a stream walk. We walked up about 10 miles of drain and stream looking for problems along the bank. We collated some of the beach sampling results from the health department, looking at that over time. We also did what's known as a loading analysis, so I'm going to show you a lot of results that are in terms of concentrations, but the actual load, the amount of the mass of material that makes its way to Lake Erie is a combination of how much flow there is and what the concentration is. So we did a loading analysis to look at that. And then the tillage surveys, I'm leaving the tillage surveys to Rob, Thad, and Pete from DEQ. They'll go into the details on their surveys after this, my little piece. And then the wetland restorability assessment, DEQ also did that, and I'll tell you what I'm referring to here in a bit. I don't have time maybe to go through all the details, but just a couple really the important pieces. So this is the mouth of the Lapointe drain right here. So the Lapointe drain itself, watershed, is here, and then you have you've got sulfur up here and muddy through here. Those are the two other big tribs that are directly drained to Lake Erie, and we had 12 different stations that were distributed. We tried to distribute them so we're at the mouth of the main tribs, and then we work upstream. So in our water quality assessment, we would literally go out, and we had at least 2 people, most times we probably had 3 or 4 people who were out at a time, and we would go out and grab, basically take a bucket, put the bucket in, fill a bottle. We would measure, in the field, we measured electrical conductivity, which is a measure of salt, essentially, in the water. We measured dissolved oxygen, we measured temperature, and then the samples themselves were sent to the City of Monroe wastewater treatment plant, and they analyzed those samples for suspended solids, for total phosphorus, and for E. coli. And we did this, I'd already mentioned this. This just so you can see over here, these are the sample locations that the health department does along Luna Pier Beach, just so you can see where they're taken. A canine assessment. We were out with 2 dogs. I just wanted to show you. I mean, the cool thing about the dogs is they can identify human sewage, you know, in the water body itself. The other thing that we did, because we only had a day, is one team would go to a remote location, take samples, bring the samples back, and then have the dogs sniff the sample. And so they were actually able to work, so to speak, on multiple locations at the same time. It was really amazing. And I must admit, I was a little bit of a skeptic when we started this. It seemed kind of unfathomable to me that the dogs could literally differentiate between some other warm-blooded animals, you know, stuff, as opposed to human sewage. And when we first got out, we went to the beach, and the dog literally went right to the sanitary sewer. and basically, we were like, okay, all right, maybe there is something here. So we got out on 5 separate events, sampling events. And this is, you can see, this is May, June, and then we did one in November. This is all 2015. We wanted to go out when it rained, or close in time to when it rained, because some of the drains, sometimes in the summer, are actually dry. So it's really hard to grab a water quality sample when they're not flowing. So this is some of the results. So this is E. coli. These are what's known as, these are just counts of organisms. And this scale here goes from 0 to 5,000. The DEQ standards, the things that if exceeded cause the impairments, are down here with these red lines. So you have a daily average line, which is 130 organisms per 100 milliliters of water. That's that lower red bar. And then above it is the 30-day average, which is 300 organisms per 100 milliliters of sample. And you can pretty much see in the 12 stations that are distributed around Lapointe, and Muddy and Sulphur and the other drains that come in, they pretty much exceed all the time. And that was one of the reasons we made the decision to get the dogs, was because any warm-blooded animal that's gone to the bathroom, if you will, in and around the water bodies has the potential to have E. coli in it. And so seeing these high numbers doesn't by itself tell you what the source is. It just tells you those are the numbers. So again, going back to the theme, prioritize problems, prioritize solutions, you know, we're trying here to rank the concentrations. But again, this ranking of concentrations is based on just straight E. coli counts and not what the source is. So we get the dogs out, we have a day. The triangles represent the results. These green circles are just the station, our water quality sampling stations. So superimposed on top with the triangles are the results from the dogs. A positive means, in this instance, both dogs alerted. That's the term. Both dogs basically signified that they had found a human sewage signal, if you will. And you can see we only had 4 of those. This is the watershed of the Lapointe drain, and then up here is one station on Sulphur. And then the mixed ones, we did have some instances where one dog would alert and the other dog would not. So it wasn't a completely positive identification of a human source. And then the green triangles here, 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 and here, neither dog alerted. Neither dog signified that it was a human source. So again, while we're trying to prioritize problems, I mean, one of the things that we found in Lapointe, and this will also become clear when we talk about implementation, is that we never really found a smoking gun, if you will. Right? We never found some overwhelming problem in some singular location that we were able to pinpoint and then say, that's the culprit. The theme, even though we say prioritize problems, prioritize solutions, the theme of this particular watershed are the problems seem to be fairly spatially distributed, which when we talk about implementation means that the implementation has to be fairly spatially distributed as well. One other interesting thing that we found when we were analyzing the county's data for the beach. So these are E. coli counts again, and we didn't look at every data point. These are the counts from the county sampling over this is just the summer of 2016. When the wind is blowing from the west, right? So the wind is actually blowing out to the lake. We found a couple instances where the concentrations were below the standards. When the wind was blowing in to the beach, and occasionally we found when the wind was coming from the south and sometimes from the north, I have other data points like this, we tended, not always, but we tended to see exceedances. So one of the issues with the beach could be that there's not a distinct source immediately adjacent to the beach. It could be that a source that's outside of the beach and out in the lake is getting either blown in to the lakeshore or, and there's work to show this, E. coli can actually survive in the sand. So I think we'd always thought they needed a warm-blooded host to survive, but they don't necessarily. They can survive in the sand. And there's work to show that if the sand that gets resuspended, the bacteria that's living in the sand also gets resuspended. So this project has proven that, I mean, like I said, there's no smoking gun, and the beach itself is an interesting case study in that we still aren't quite sure what's going on, and there is this other piece of evidence that suggests that it may be the wind and bacteria that's in the sand that could be part of the problem. Total phosphorus, let me jump to the next one. Again, so you see all 12 stations arrayed here. Whoops. You see the average, and then the max and the min, and then this is, DEQ doesn't have a ambient total phosphorus target, or requirement, if you will, but they do have a recommended target of 0.1 milligrams per liter, and you can see here that some of the averages are below, some of the averages are above, and then almost all the maximums, with a few exceptions, are all well above. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I think I'm almost done here. Are well above the target for almost all the stations. So again, an issue that seems to kind of be arrayed across the entire subwatershed. Again, we tried to, you know, the darker the green, the more phosphorus that particular watershed, the concentrations coming from that watershed. But, you know, you look at this, and again, with the exceptions of these guys right here, all of them are at times exceeding these concentrations. And I said we tried to get out when it rained. Most of the time we got out just after it rained. And I think I can say with a lot of confidence, if we were actually out there when it was raining hard, these numbers would be higher, right? So these numbers, the concentrations have probably already started to come down after the event has passed. Whoops. And then here's dissolved oxygen. I mentioned we've done dissolved oxygen at all the stations. Here is this blue line is DEQ's warm water minimum daily limit. That is to say that the range, dissolved oxygen actually cycles on highs and lows from day to night. And this is the minimum. And again, you can see, I think, yeah, all of this, the minimums at all of the stations are below that minimum. And then this is the warm water average daily limit, which is 5. So again, for warm water fishes to be able to have enough oxygen to survive in the water column, you got to have DO on average above that. And you can see almost across the board, almost all the averages are at or very close to that limit. So, I mean, this DO problem is not just a problem that's occurring at the mouth of Lapointe. It's a problem across all the stations. As I mentioned, we did stream walk, and the kinds of things that we looked at, that we were looking for. So we literally are in the channel or immediately adjacent to the channel and walking the channel and just writing things down and identifying locations. So we're looking at things like buffer width. Danielle hit on this. Either filter strip or riparian buffer width. It's interesting. My concept of a buffer and your concept of a buffer may be different. So that may account for, right, anything below 5 feet is really, I think, from our perspective, is not, it's probably not going to be functioning well as a buffer or a filter strip. Looking for algae blooms, for erosion, stream crossings, tile outlets. But I will tell you, in general, I'll give you kind of an overall impression. I think that what we felt and what Danielle talked about was most farms that we walked, people are cropping pretty much up to the top of bank. And that's the issue that we're talking about, is that you're essentially, you're spreading your fertilizer out to the top of the bank. I mean, between the corn, there tends to be very little growth, so it's essentially bare ground. You cut the corn, and if you take all the residue off, and depending how you deal with your residue, There are some farms where essentially you can have almost bare earth once you're done, with your growing season. So this was a kind of just a typical picture of things that we saw a lot during our walk. The other thing about Lapointe, and I think this is my last slide in this portion, and again, these are probably things that you know, but what you're looking at is a map that DEQ prepared for wetland restorability, but the wetland restorability map is essentially based on what we think the historical wetlands looked like, right? So DEQ looks at both hydric soils, which tend to be soils that are saturated most of the time, that tend to be wetland soils. And then they looked at, we actually have, and it's really cool if you don't know, Michigan has a set of pre-settlement vegetation maps for the entire state. Those pre-settlement vegetation maps actually come from the surveyors who were out surveying Michigan in early 1800s. The surveyors took pretty detailed notes, so they would literally be, they would be walking off their lines, and then they would be saying, there's an old beech tree here and the vegetation is such and such. So the DNR has basically put together maps from surveyors' notes. When you overlay those maps with the hydric soil layers, there tends to be a correlation. So what you're essentially looking at, the green is high restorability, I think the red is low and the yellow is medium, but essentially what you're looking at is Lapointe watershed used to be mostly wetlands. And probably anybody who farms and manages water, they already know that. And I think that's, yeah, I need to finish up. So again, we went through a prioritization process, and unlike maybe the public survey information, I think, part of this nutrient, the phosphorus problem and the DO problem really relates back to essentially, I would say, if you had to prioritize it, and this is, I don't say this because I want to point the finger, but it is our job, again, to prioritize problems and to prioritize solutions, and clearly, with 75% of the land use in agriculture in the watershed, a high proportion of our issue is generated by agriculture. And again, I'm not trying to implicate anybody. I'm just trying to give you the facts as we saw them on the ground. And then the partial body contact recreation, the E. coli. This is a tough one. Again, you saw those kind of mixed results. It's hard for us not to feel like the human source of sewage in the watershed is most likely from septic systems, from failing septic systems. And you heard that Danielle mentioned that 13%, which is an interesting number, indicated that they had some kind of failure in their septic systems, and I suspect the number may be higher. I think I want to turn this over. But again, we're trying to spatially prioritize problems, and you can see this, the red indicating our number one, and this is looking at using the tillage surveys, using the water quality surveys, using the canine surveys, the stream walk surveys. We still end up, and maybe not surprisingly, with essentially our number one priority particularly to work with the phosphorus issue is the watershed of Lapointe Drain. And with that, I believe it's your turn.
So on your agenda, we're at the tillage survey, and we have Rob Selesky from the Michigan DEQ, who has been our project DEQ resource person for the duration, so that's been great. And the team, Peter Vincent and others who aren't here, so we are very grateful for that.
As she mentioned, I'm Rob Stileski. I'm here with Thad Cleary and Peter Vincent. We're from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality Non-Point Source Program. And we're here to talk to you tonight about the agricultural inventory that was done as part of the Watershed Management Plan development. So I'm going to try to go through my part of the presentation real quick and hand it over to Thad because he's going to talk kind of about the meat of it, the results and recommendations. But here's just a quick outline of things that we're going to cover in our presentation tonight. I'll talk about the inventory process and kind of how we developed that. We'll also go over results and recommendations from the inventory. And we'll wrap things up with a summary and talking about how the information we collected can hopefully guide next steps for local implementation of the plan. So kind of what Scott was just talking about, land use can be a good indicator of potential non-point source issues in a watershed. And depending on the data source you look at, the predominant land use in the Lapointe watershed is agriculture. Scott, I think, mentioned 75%. The figure I have up here is 57%. But regardless, agriculture is a big part of the land use here. And so that was a big factor in us determining what kind of inventory we wanted to do. So we settled on doing an agricultural inventory. And if you're not familiar, a watershed inventory is usually done to identify the specific pollutants that you're concerned about in your watershed, as well as the locations where they're coming from. So with this watershed, we kind of had some ideas about what the pollutants were. There was some previous monitoring that was done that kind of indicated that nutrients and sediment were going to be a concern. So we kind of knew the what already, but the where was where we really weren't sure about. So the purpose of our inventory was to identify sites having the greatest potential to contribute things like sediment, nutrients, and pathogens to waterways. By collecting information about these things, we hoped we could prioritize fields and potentially farmers to reach out to talk about doing different best management practices going forward. So there's a couple different ways that you can do a watershed inventory. We kind of used a hybrid approach of looking at aerial photography and then following that up with a windshield survey or driving the watershed. So the first thing that we did was we took an aerial photograph of the watershed and input that into our geographic information system, or GIS. Once we had that in there, we were able to overlay the watershed boundary so we had a clear idea of the area that we were working with. From there, we looked at our photograph and identified each individual agricultural field that we could pick out from the aerial photography. And that's what the red dots symbolize here. So by the time we were done, we identified 191 individual fields in the Lapointe watershed. The next step that we took was to identify the water courses. So we kind of had a working map going here now. And you can't really tell on the white background here, but the water courses are outlined on blue up there. The next step that we took was to identify fields next to water courses. And kind of our thought process is that fields next to water courses have a higher chance of maybe contributing non-point source pollutants to waterways. So as I mentioned, we identified 191 fields in total. Of those 191, 119 we identified as being next to a water body. And those are identified in the green on the map up here. So while we were doing that, we also were looking for buffers. So if there was fields that were next to water courses that had some sort of buffer between the water course and the field. Based on our review of aerial photography, we didn't see that many of those. Of the 119 fields that were next to water bodies, we saw 96 that did not have buffers. And those are kind of highlighted in the reddish brown up here on this map. And so that was kind of the upfront aerial photography part of our inventory. And the idea of this is even before stepping foot in the watershed, we had an idea kind of what the lay of the land looked like, what sort of general practices might be going on. And this is just kind of the first step in the inventory process. So we had some information that could help us prioritize areas to go to in the future, and compiling that with some of the actual windshield survey information that Thad's going to talk about here really helped us kind of pinpoint where important areas to go to might be. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Thad, and he's going to kind of walk you through some of the results and recommendations from the actual windshield survey.
Thanks, Rob. So what we did is after, I'm going to talk about the part of driving around the watershed, basically looking at all of these 191 fields. So we went out, we did in the fall of 2014, we went out and did a tillage survey. So we were looking to see what type of tillage practice was done. And we were also looking at documented what crop was grown in that field during the 2014 growing season. So we had, most of the time it was either corn, soybeans, or wheat. We did identify in 15, I think we had a couple of fields that were tomatoes and potatoes as well. So we would document the previous crop, we documented the type of fall tillage. We lumped our tillage into the different practices into one if there was no tillage at all done. So that means all the residue, whether it was corn residue, wheat stubble residue, or soybean residue, was left untouched in the fall. And we tried to go out, we went out after we thought all the tillage was done, that there wasn't going to be any more, and that was usually sometime in December we would go out and do that. The other one, another major one is chisel plowed. There was a little bit of plowed, but I'm not even sure we saw plowed, but we had, it might have been chiseled instead. There was some strip till actually done, was just the strips, tillage in small strips going across the field, so it wasn't entire tillage all the way across the field. And then mulch till, and there's different forms of mulch till. It's not as aggressive. You get more residue left on top of the ground. The reason the crop's important, because if you have like a soybean crop, there's not as much residue to begin with after it's harvested. And if it's chisel plowed, you don't get a lot of residue left versus a corn crop. There's a lot more residue after it's chisel plowed. So it's important to know the crop as well as the tillage practices. We also documented if there was wheat that was planted in that fall, and we were also looking for cover crops. Wheat could be used as a cover crop, but all of the wheat we saw planted, we actually, when we went back out the following year, it was still there and growing, which means they were harvesting it for grain. So we did not actually document any cover crops in the watershed at all for the 2 years that we did the surveys. So in the spring, we would go out in the spring, drive the entire watershed, look at all 191 fields again, and document what the amount of residue that was left after those fields had been planted. So here we would again wait till it was long enough after the planting that the fields were all planted. Usually we went in mid-June, I believe, is about when we tried to figure the planting would be done. So in the spring, we had 4 categories of residue. And this one really isn't a category of residue. It's basically, it was no-till planted. So we could tell there was no tillage had occurred in the fall. There was no tillage in the spring. It was just planted directly into the residue that was there from the previous year. Then we had a greater than 30% residue and a less than 30% residue category. The 30% is the level that is considered, if you have 30% or more, that's where you get your soil erosion reduction by having at least the 30% residue. So that's kind of the number we picked. And then we had a 4th category of basically there wasn't enough, you couldn't see residue at all hardly out there based on the tillage that was done. This is pretty much best professional judgment. It's driving down the road and looking at the fields and just making that call. And that's probably the hardest part, is breaking that between greater than or less than 30. No-till is real easy. 0 is not that hard to do. And again, we would document in the spring what crops were planted, in this case for the 2015 growing season. So here's some of the numbers, and we have, so each of those that Rob talked about, each of the 191 fields, Peter digitized all those, so we actually have the acreage for every one of those fields. So we could tell you not only how many acres, how many fields were chisel plowed, but the actual acres of that for the watershed. So for 2014, you can see the numbers. The skipped are grass fields. Some fields we couldn't see from the road, so there was a number of acres that got skipped. So we had the chisel plowing in the fall of 14. There was a little over 2,000 acres, and in the fall of 15 we had almost 2,500 acres. One thing we'll point out is the fall of 14 was a late harvest and a wet fall, and there was actually less tillage done that year, and you could tell that in our numbers. The mulch till you could see went from 425 acres up to almost 1,400 acres. No-till planted is fields that were planted to wheat in the fall by a no-till practice. You can tell the ones that were. Tilled planted down on the bottom there was, you could tell there was some type of tillage done before the wheat was planted. The no tillage is the amount of acres where no tillage occurred. You could see it went from 2,300 acres in 14 down to 700 acres. So again, it was the weather and when the harvest occurred versus actually what tillage practices the farmers were doing. So we probably think that the 2015 tillage is probably more representative of what normally occurs based on the growing season and when harvest occurred and such. Spring of 2015 and 2016 residue, the 0% residue was almost 2,100 acres in 15, and it was about 1,100 acres in 16. Greater than 30 went from 1,200 down to 900. Less than 30% residue went up from 1,400 up to 2,200 acres. No tillage, these were fields that actually were not planted when we went out there. It was a wet spring in 15 and the planting was late, so there's some fields that actually hadn't even been touched at all. Nothing had changed since the fall, and so that's what those represent. The no-till acres is pretty consistent, about 571 acres in spring of 15 and about 546. So it's kind of interesting because you can take these numbers and compare them to the surveys that were done and kind of see these are actual numbers of what happened out there. The wheat acres went up from 800 acres in 15 up to 1,500 acres in 16 that was planted to wheat. So then what you do, we had all this data, so we used the GIS and we basically, and you could do a number of different queries with this data to try to pull it out and how you can use it. We just got some examples of what it can show you. So this shows you a map. So of the 119 fields in proximity to a water body that don't have buffers that Rob showed you, 45 of those had some type of fall tillage in 2014. And then you can see the type of chisel plowing obviously was the predominant type of tillage that was done. 2015, again the same thing, and you can see which fields, and you can start doing multiple and overlay these things and see, okay, which ones are being consistently chisel plowed, which we'll get to here. So what we're trying to do is take this and get that down from the original 191 fields down to what's the priority fields, going and talking to those landowners and those farmers who are farming them, getting it down to a manageable number that you can approach. So these are the 19 fields, about 720 acres that were chisel plowed both in the fall of 14 and 15. Doesn't mean necessarily that there's problems because of that, but these are the fields that because of where they're at next to water bodies, they don't have buffers, and the type of tillage and the amount of residue that are left out there, these are good places to starting ways. Again, it doesn't mean that every one of these fields is causing a problem, but it's rather than starting at 191, you're down to 19 fields that you could start to look at. For the residue, of the 119 fields next to water body without buffers, 61 of them in 2015 had less than 30% residue. So those would be the ones that are more susceptible, less residue, more susceptible to runoff, erosion. So priorities and recommendations. Again, fields with the highest probability of contributing pollutants to waterways, those next to water bodies, those lacking buffers, the ones with more intensive tillage practices, and less than the 30% residue. Again, there's multiple ways you could look at the data to kind of get to this. And I guess the main thing is getting it down to those fields, but also in the past, primarily the programs that have gone for cost sharing these types of practices have been more to just those that are willing and want to do it. And we're trying to get to those, landowners and farmers where maybe the issues are occurring and try to, talk to them and target them instead of just those that are willing to come in. You're more likely to see improvements if you can target the molecular sources of the pollutants. So as far as the recommended practices, probably the number one in relation to the phosphorus issue, and we have no information on this, you can't see it on aerial photos, you can't see it by driving by, but nutrient management. Like knowing, somebody going out and talking to farmers, what are their soil test levels of their phosphorus? What's their nutrient management practices? When do they apply their fertilizer? How do they apply it? That type of stuff. That's probably the most important practice from a phosphorus standpoint. Cover crops, again, we didn't see any cover crops, but using cover crops reduces soil erosion. It'll tie up the nutrients so that they're less susceptible to running off. Reduce tillage to reduce the soil erosion, keep that soil there, and the phosphorus that's attached to the soil on the field instead. Buffer strips for filtering the soil out. And drainage water management, it's a newer practices, but for fields that are tiled, under-drained, putting tile line control structures on those so you hold some of that water back. And if you reduce the amount of water coming out of those tile lines, obviously you're going to reduce the amount of phosphorus coming out of those tile lines. And it's actually an easy practice to sell to farmers because in dry years there's going to be a benefit. You hold that water in the field and you got more there available for the crop that's growing. And it can be done so you're not going to damage the crop. You always keep the water below the roots of the crops when it's growing so you're not flooding out your fields. So next steps, data from specific sites helps prioritize the inventory that we did. This can be done again. People, you can add more data to this. Somebody could go out and collect the same thing, and you could collect another whole year's and start getting more specific data. Watershed management plan sets it up for implementation. Again, working with the priority landowners. What we look for implementation proposals are specific recommendations, and having information like this that you could say, okay, we had these 191 fields, manipulate that, use the data however you want to use it to get down to a smaller number. I just showed you a couple of ways you can do that, but to say, okay, we're going to target the landowners and the farmers that farm these 60 or pick out whatever that number is. That's the kind of thing we're looking for, and these are the types of practices that you're going to do. Those kind of proposals, when we get those will be a high priority as far as funding. I think that's it. Yep.
Thanks, Thad. Okay, so going back to the theme that I stated earlier, right? Prioritize problems, prioritize solutions. We're going to get into now the implementation plan part of this. And so we had a couple of things that we had to try to do. One was to try to figure out, is it possible for us to meet, particularly for phosphorus, and the suspended solids that carry the phosphorus, can we can we actually achieve the TMDL target for phosphorus and for solids? And again, TMDL's total maximum daily load. As Danielle said, it's been computed by DEQ how much of that particular substance the water body can take, so to speak, on a daily basis and sustain the water quality that's necessary for its uses, whether it's agricultural water or whether it's for warm water fishes. So I had mentioned we had generated concentrations with the field sampling. We also generated loads by making estimates of flows in these various creeks and drains. And then we set up it's basically a spreadsheet model that runs through these loads given the conditions as they are today, knowing how many acres are in row crop, knowing how much land is urban land, all the various land uses, all the soil types are defined, how erodible the soil types are, that kind of thing. So we took existing conditions and we said, okay, let's start to look at if we apply certain classes of BMPs. And in particular, we spent most of our time on agricultural best management practices. We did look at other things for urban land and for suburban land and homeowners. But again, the bulk of the land use and the bulk of the problem appears to be from agricultural land use. So this right here is the TMDL, total maximum daily load target, in pounds of phosphorus for Lapointe drain at the mouth. So you're looking at, I think it's about 2.5 pounds of phosphorus per day in the drain. So here's the target right here. Here's existing conditions as we measured them and estimated them. So then we ran across now are the scenarios that we ran in the model. So this is, we assumed that 25% of those fields that Thad was talking about now have a buffer, a reasonable buffer, and I think that the buffer in the model, I think it was 10 feet wide on each side. And then reduced tillage. And I confess I can't remember exactly what reduced tillage means. I don't think it's no till, but I'm not positive. Anyway, the point here is we extend buffers over a quarter of the fields that don't have them today, and we get this load reduction, which is almost 2 pounds, so we're down to 6 roughly. Then we ran another scenario where we went 100% reduced tillage. Again, I think it's no till. We get a slight reduction. We go to 50% of the fields and we implement buffers over half the remaining farm fields that don't have buffers. We go to no-till, we get a slightly lower reduction, on and on and on until we finally start to get close to the target. We actually found we had to put buffers on all the farm fields, and we had to reduce tillage. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that what we found thus far in Lapointe, if we're going to hit targets, we've got to get high participation in these kinds of practices. Now, this is just a numeric representation of the data. It's not necessarily a completely accurate description of what has to happen out there. The implementation plan has a feedback loop where we're doing testing, we're looking at results, and then we're modifying as we go. So we'll be able to tell a lot once we start to try to implement these in certain fields, particularly if they are, as Thad was talking about, if they're concentrated in an area where we believe the potential for the highest losses of sediment and phosphorus are for fields, and we target those, we monitor the progress. It may not be that this is a prediction of what has to happen. It's just simply trying to get to how do we formulate a rational plan with limited funds, and we target those funds. But the point of the slide is the problems appear to be fairly well distributed in the watershed, and there's no one smoking gun. So the implementation plan, I have just some highlights here. I have a couple of slides after this that have the entire list, and I I think for the sake of time, I'm not going to run through the entire list, but I'm just going to stick to the highlights. The entire list, as Danielle said, you can get hard copy, you can get electronic copy on the website. You'll see the entire list there. I think our number one focus will be agricultural improvements. And I actually neglected a couple of points that Thad made. I have here improving tillage practices, expanding the use of cover cropping, and then wider and more extensive use of buffers. But I also have to bring up nutrient management. That should be the first bullet. And I think I've heard, what is it, the 4 R's? Right place, right time, right amount. And what's the fourth one? You're supposed to know. Right source. Right, so that would be the first thing. Not to put any more fertilizer on the fields than they actually need to produce the amount of crop that, you know, the farmers come to expect. So that would be the first thing. And then I think the issue with farming is some of the practices that we suggest, for instance, wider buffers and filter strips. And another thing that I don't have on the points, but another thing that we've talked about in the plan would be two-stage ditches. The problem with two-stage ditches, buffers, and filter strips from the farmer's perspective is it takes his or her land to do it, usually, right? Unless they've already started out with a 10-foot buffer. If they're cropping all the way to the top of the drain or top of the stream, then if we come and we tell them we want you to take 10 feet on either side and we want you to extend it the length of the stream, obviously that's a little bit of a problem for the farmer because it takes land out of production. And that's why what Thad said I think is so important. You start at the top of the list with nutrient management. Cover cropping is something that doesn't take a farmer's land. Improving tillage practices does not take a farmer's land. Drain management also does not take any of the land. So certainly you could work through a list like that and then as needed work through buffers and filter strips and two-stage ditches. A two-stage ditch, just so you know, if you're not aware, you know, a lot of ditches are kind of a trapezoid shape. A two-stage ditch would actually make them slightly wider and then put a little bench so the bottom of the channel would have a cutout like that. And so the lower portion of that channel would take all the low flows. When high flows come, they would flood, so to speak, within the channel itself, depositing sediment up on those banks. And what that allows you potentially is that you have a channel that takes care of itself. It keeps a lot more nutrients and solids within the channel, and it potentially doesn't need as much maintenance to keep it clean. But the downside is, as you may have noticed from it's wider, right? So again, there's the potential where you've got to cut in potentially into active cropland, which I completely understand is potentially taking away someone's livelihood. On-site wastewater management, I'll be the person who says this out loud. It's probably been said out loud before, but I'll say it again. In Monroe County, point of sale inspection ordinance for on-site wastewater treatment plants. I know realtors really not a big fan of this, but it seems to make sense in the type of landscape that we're at. If you have a failing septic system, it should be identified and it should be dealt with. Certainly there are implications in low-lying land that has shallow groundwater with improving septics. I get that, but from the perspective of what we're trying to accomplish here, I think this would go a long way to identifying failing septic systems and dealing with them. I think there's more work that needs to be done in terms of identifying potential illicit sources or other human sources. The plan certainly recommends additional source tracking work and having the dogs out again. I think they were very helpful. Some additional assessments, the canals, it's still unclear to me to what extent the canals in Luna Pier actually contribute to water quality issues, and so I think somebody needs to look at that. The Harbor Club, there may not be any issues with the Harbor Club, but I put it in there because they both sit right on the reach that has some of the worst problems in the watershed. So this is the long list. I won't go through it. Suffice to say there are a set of recommendations for lots of different kinds of things. It's not just agriculture. That just happens to be a focus for what we think needs to happen in the watershed. I won't go through all the implementation schedules. Suffice to say, right now we have the schedule going out to 2029. We have these are the larger sets of activities. We've got milestones in here, and then we essentially, what we have also is our goals, our numeric targets for each of the goals, right? Because you can't get something done if you're not measuring it. And then the other thing that we've tried to be cognizant, there's not a lot of money for us to do a lot of this stuff into the future, so we're relying as much as we can on assessments that are already being done in the watershed. So for a lot of the water quality work, we're going to rely, DEQ does a 5-year water quality, they hit all the water quality bodies in Michigan once every 5 years. They'll be back. We're going to rely somewhat on their assessment work. Monroe County, as far as I know, will be continuing in perpetuity to sample the beach, and we'll be relying on them. And then a big part of it too will be is hopefully the River Raisin Institute can continue to build capacity and be a leader in the watershed for helping keep this effort moving. And that's it. That's the plan in a nutshell.
Some of you may be, thank you, Scott, and also Peter and Ned and Rob. Some of you may have been writing questions down throughout, or if not, good too. We do have time for questions, but I'd like to introduce our next presenter. Our probably key and most important stakeholder are the farmers, and so we're really delighted to have Doug Darling here talk about conservation farming in Monroe County. He's Darling Farms, so I will hand over the microphone to you, and we're so happy you're here.
My boys would tell you it's easier to listen to me when they're eating cookies, so, so by all means, yeah. I'm Doug Darling. I'm a full-time farmer here in Monroe County. I'm a partner at Darling Farms. It's a partnership with my parents, Elgin and Joanne, and then my wife, Helen. Our farm is a sesquicentennial farm. It's been in the family since 1833, so for those of you doing the math, that's before Michigan was a state, so we've been here a little while. I have 3 sons. They're the 7th generation on the farm. They help out some. I've got one son who's very interested in the farm. My youngest is a sophomore at Washtenaw Community College. He just graduated from high school this spring. And then I have another son who's a sophomore at Michigan State University studying agriculture. And then my oldest son just graduated from Michigan State last spring in physics, and he's now back up there in grad school for business analytics. So with 3 kids in college, it's kind of like they're eating a lot of things and laundry and all kinds of wild stuff when they do show up back around the farm. So, but our farm, it's about 1,600 acres, and we raise corn, soybeans, wheat, and some hay. And my boys, they just raise my blood pressure. So we've got this great energy always going on around the place. On our farm is, we also do custom farming for a number of other people that we harvest and custom farm another 400 acres usually annually, and sometimes we'll harvest for additional people too when they get in a pinch. But our farming operation is a MEEP verified farm, which is a Michigan Agriculture Environmentally Assured Program verified farm. And what that means is we invite the we invite the regulators, we invite the Michigan Department of Agriculture and their representatives to our farm periodically. And what they do is they go through my fertilizer records. They look at my fertilizer receipts. They see what I've bought. They look at the amount of acres that I've planted. They look at the crops that I've planted. They look at my production. They'll actually go through my yield data, that they see that from what I have harvested corresponds agronomically with the amount of fertilizer I put on. They look at my soil test. They go through all of those things. They look at my pesticide records. They see what herbicides I used, what insecticides I used, if I had to use any. fungicides. They look at the whole management scheme of what goes on our farm. We do have a comprehensive nutrient management plan on our farm. We did that 15 years ago. Also, when they come out there to do the meat verification on our farm, they also look at our farmstead, how our farm is set up. They look at what my fertilizer storage is, what the containment capacity is, what the condition is. They look at my fuel storage for how that's set up. That's one that you have very little return on investment. That one's just a big tombstone mine. When we spent the money on that, my wife pointed out, I spent more money on that containment fuel pad on our farm than what I spent in the last 5 years for family vacations. So you have some interesting discussions sometimes when you're trying to prioritize what things you're going to do. They also look at our pesticide storage and for what we have on our farm. So we voluntarily invite them to our farm. The benefit, one of the things, if you're a Farm Bureau insurance, you get a discount on your insurance, which doesn't account for the amount of time and work that you have to do. The other thing where there's the real value if you become meat verified is by going through this process, doing the self-examination, you can sometimes find some areas where you can economically improve your operation, do a little better job of managing. So that's one of the things that we support, encourage farmers to do. We've got over 4,400 farms throughout the entire state of Michigan that are meat verified, that have gone through this complete process and are periodically being reviewed. But we've got, I think it's like nearly another 5,000 farms that are almost there. They're just missing one or two things, that they either haven't put in a fuel pad or they haven't done something with part of their farm for their cropping program. They're very, very close. And so there's a lot of very good things that are going on industry-wide in the state with that. When you mentioned about the 4 R's, 4 R's is this much, MEEP is this much. Because periodically, because we're so close to the Toledo media market, Ohio back here a few years ago, you probably heard, passed of legislation that requires the farmers to get a license in order to apply fertilizer if you're greater than 50 acres. Actually, it's probably sometimes it's the guys that's less than 50 acres they probably ought to be looking at, but it's not necessarily a measurable outcome. You got a license. Okay. MEEP, you have measurable outcomes. You have folks coming in, taking a look at the farm. Not everybody's going to do it. Not everybody has to do it. Some people will be meeting the standards even though they don't have the regulations come in. There's a lot of folks in that capacity. Another thing, on our farm, I've got 49 acres in CRP, filter strips, as you guys are talking about. Filter strips are hands down the easiest nutrient management plan you can put in on a farm. You put them in, they do the job. You don't have to manage them. Yeah, you go out there and you mow them. You might have to periodically disc them. Or the last time management, you had to burn them, or you could burn them as an option. Which then you got neighbors calling fire departments and everybody's running around. So anyway, but filter strips, hands down easiest. And they do find that down to as small as 10 feet will have an impact for nutrient retention for what that does. That one is hands down the easiest one. You go to the FSA office to get those. That's the easiest way to get through. Challenge we're bumping into is we're in a farm bill. We're coming up for a new farm bill that's being negotiated. Currently, there's a 24 million acre cap nationally. We are right at that cap. We're a little over, a little below. And so that could be part of the challenges. We try to get farmers in. There are some cost share dollars to do that. But if the cap's hit, there's not going to be cost share dollars available. And when you talked about like the farmer or who tilled right up to the edge of the field, to the edge of the ditch scenario, it's kind of like, hey, you go to work this week, but that last hour that you work, I'm not going to pay you for. That's the way the farmer's looking at it. I'm paying taxes. Put in perspective, the highest taxes I pay for a farm, bare land, is $28.50 an acre. That's a lot of money for just bare land. And so you're trying to figure out how do you get a return on investment? How do you get that back, that you're trying to pay your bills, cover your costs? So that's why some of those folks will farm almost too close, or too close to the edge of the road in some scenarios, because they're trying to cover their costs, cover their bills, make the return. And if they're paying interest on making farm payments, if you're paying interest on a $500,000 combine, you're trying to figure out how you're going to find every dollar you can. So that's, when you start talking about these programs, the simplest thing is come down to dollars and cents. If you can show a farmer how he's going to save money or he's going to make money, he will adopt the practice. The CRP, there are some cost shares where the federal government's putting dollars in. That's the easiest one to put in for what you're looking for your target. We also do cover crop on our farm. We've scaled it back a little bit. Where we do our cover crop is after wheat. For those of you folks that you're talking about, what cover crop went in, fall cover crop. We're in Michigan. It gets cold in the fall. So you're taking your soybeans off that last week of September into early October. You're harvesting through October. You try to plant something. Usually, traditionally, our frost period is usually about the 10th of October. A lot of the things that go in for cover crop will die with the frost. And when you start plugging in the cost, ideally, the perfect place to do cover crop, in my book, because I won't do it in the fall because I'm wasting my money and my time, is to do it after wheat. That ground's going to lay fallow for 9 months. It's doing nothing. So you put cover crop out, and that gives you time that you can do it in August, late July. You've got opportunity to do it for where your management scheme is, depending on what crops you're doing. Put it in after wheat. Now, here's why you've seen a little bit of a decline in cover crop. 2 reasons. The cost of the seed has gone up because it's gotten popular. Second, because the cost of fertilizer, commercial fertilizer, has come down. Now, to put in perspective, I bought some of my fertilizer back here this summer for about $150 a ton for my nitrogen. Right now, it's about $198 a ton, give or take, play with it. And 28%, that's 560 pounds of nitrogen. That's about 30 cents a pound for that nitrogen. Cover crop. If I plant cover crop, even if I do it in July, I get radishes that are like this, because you're capturing the nutrients that are there that you didn't utilize in the crop. So even if I have a good stand, you're looking at about 90 pounds worth of nitrogen. And the best thing to do is try to get it into the soil at some point in time. Because if you leave it up there, as it rots down, you lose nitrogen to the atmosphere. It likes to go up. So at 90 pounds, and if I'm spending $42 or $45 an acre on seed and fuel and wear and tear on my equipment and labor, 90 pounds, I just spent $2 a pound for that nitrogen. And now you're looking at 30 cents or $2. Economically, where's a businessman going to go? And then here, with where commodity prices have been, you take the price of corn on December 31st this year, take the price of corn December 31st of 2016, there's 1 penny difference. The markets have been flat. So as you're trying to cover, taxes keep going up, healthcare keeps going up, my auto insurance keeps going up. So the question is do you buy cover crop seed, or do you pay your health care? Do you buy cover crop seed and spend the money on the fuel, or are you paying your homeowner's insurance? Or are you paying down some of the debt that you have on equipment? Or your kid's saying, hey, I got this great $350 book that I've got to have for a class. And it's like, hey, that's on them, but every once in a while you got to loan them money. So the question is, if you're tight on money, what's going to get cut? First place going to get cut is cover crop. Even if there is cost share and there's very few programs that you can't repeat, then ideally, hands down, put it on wheat stubble. But it's going to be on the farmer to do it because there's not going to be the cost share annually to do that right now. Our farming operation, we're predominantly no-till. Of that 1,600 acres, over 1,000 acres of that was no-till that we do, 1,000, 1,100. We'll subsoil after the wheat stubble sometime in December that will work that cover crop down. Still a ton of residue on the ground. If we don't get back into the field in the spring to get it leveled out, it's a mess because that stuff is still kind of growing with the rye or different things that we've got mixed in there. So it takes management, it takes time. And so that's where the farmer gets pressed for what he's going to be doing. But we have done the cover crop to get creative, to cut costs. Soybeans, if you got a decent stand of soybeans and they're not going to produce anything, you can get about 80, 90 pounds of nitrogen out of a stand of soybeans if you're going to till them down. In the in the seed industry, I should say, at the end of the spring, they've got so much seed that they've raised. If it's treated, they'll try to push it in areas for double crop. Michigan, down here in the southern area, we've got some folks that try it. once in a while you'll hear somebody with bragging rights, and usually the best thing to have done was to chisel plow down for the greatest value for what you're going to do. We managed to draw down on one of the seed companies to get at a real big discount the seed that would have been gone to landfill or been burnt, because treated seed you can't carry over for soybeans. The germination just tanks terribly. So we kind of knocked our costs down to about $25 an acre for doing our cover crop this summer. We still did it. We did buy a little bit of radishes mixed into it, but we planted a whole bunch of soybeans. Unfortunately, we had no rain right in our track, so it was a semi-bust on those beans, but we were trying to get creative on how do you do cover crop and do it cheap, because right now, economically, it doesn't bode. As I mentioned, we did the tub, we have not done any of the tile control gate valves. That one does impact water and the water quality for what's going on in our watersheds, but it also takes management. It takes time. Farmers have got to go out there and manage it, especially in the spring when the crops are small and you're worried about the amount of water that their roots are in. So there's some challenges with that, but they're also expensive. They're like $850 a pop for putting those in. There's some cost share on some of those things, but those do work. But if I were to give you anything, cover crop after wheat, or doing the filter strips for what you're talking about for your plan, and having measurable outcomes, because our farming operation is in the Stony Creek watershed predominantly. That's about 88,000 acres. The other portion of our farm is in the River Raisin watershed, and that's over 500,000 acres in there. That's over 1,000 square miles. When you talk about measurable outcomes, you guys are starting to do your water testing. Heidelberg was doing water testing on the River Raisin. They started back in 2008. By 2014, they had already achieved about a 36% reduction in the total dissolved phosphorus. So and why? So you're asking yourself, why did that see that much of a change? You can take it back to a good portion of Lapointe County. They have 79 miles of filter strips in that county. They had a technician, Tom Van Wagner, got programs on the ground, got the guys in the doors, got them signed up. They put them in. They put in tile control gates. There's also a lot of farms that are meat verified, livestock farms that are meat verified. So if you're looking for measurable outcomes from voluntary programs, here's one that's already been done. And this was done by the Heidelberg and a handful of other folks that were involved with that as well. So I just leave that with you, that I found it interesting, your polling, because it's public polling, it's opinion. It's not necessarily science. There was a couple things on those charts I would have expected to have been far different coming from the residents, because you're in the Toledo media market. And the way some of the things have been portrayed there, it makes you scratch your head for how that's come across regarding agriculture. And then you've heard, I don't know how many times, dollars that have been announced, that USDA announced, $1 million here, $5 million here. The general public thinks farmers have got $1 billion that we can do things with. But because of the process for whether it's going through the FSA or NRCS, the guidelines are written by the federal government. And there's a lot of hoops, and you got to score. And there are a lot of times that farmers are not getting dollars to put it onto the ground, where you could actually do something measurable. Instead, I know that there was a study that just came out of U of M yesterday regarding the toxins being airborne from the algae. I don't know if you guys saw that one. So there's a lot of money that's been spent on studies, which are great because it gives you benchmarks. We have measurables to know what we've done. But on the same note, the folks that can do something on the farm, we're having a difficult time getting the dollars to do it, because we're trying to make our ends meet, as I illustrated for some of the economics. If you can show how it's going to make money, farmers will sign up. So I've probably taken longer than you want, in case you have any questions. So, and I'll leave this with you.
Great.
I think you've probably seen that a couple of times
Okay, thank
over.
you. All right.
So,
Just a minute or so, and then if you have questions, you can do that now. But I do want to show you the project, the database website. So all the information is on this website. Let's see here. And I believe we have that on the, it's also on the agenda, at the bottom of the agenda. So you can see when you go there, there'll be, is that under ecological stewardship, right? So you, across the top, you have the topics, home, environmental education, et cetera. And then you get to ecological stewardship. If you click on that, there'll be a drop-down box. We'll say Lapointe project. So if you click there, that's where all this information resides. So you can go back and read it. You can print it out. You can look at what's been discussed tonight in, you know, we've just, you know, done the highlights. Is that the last one more? Okay. So there's the, you know, this is just some examples of what it looks like. We have the project description. This is all in the notebook that we brought a copy of. If anybody wants to look at it tonight, we have a copy. We might even have a couple copies here. And then it has the, you know, there's a table of contents. There are lots of resources that are included in the watershed plan. All of the sources that were used in the project are identified in this plan as well. So articles, studies, etc. Those are also identified. The public opinion survey is there. A copy of it is there. All these charts are there. There are many more charts than what we shared tonight. The two surveys, the one that we sent to the farmers, the one that we sent to the non-farming participants are there. There are a lot of photos of what we've done in the plan that are there as well. All the graphs and charts and so on are included. So just want you to know that. So questions?
Is the implementation plan that Scott had up there
Yes. Yes. The implementation plan that Scott, when he showed that, all those pages, all the recommendations, those are on the website. Those are in the plan. Oh, some questions over here. Does someone want to get the cards there? Please. Yeah, we were supposed to pick them up, right? Thank you. Okay, I'm going to read the questions and then whoever. Oh. Okay. Any questions that we don't get to tonight, you can direct them to us that's our website, or you can get our individual emails we can give you tonight as well. Oh, thank you. It's also on the agenda. Thanks, John. All right, number one, are the canines able to detect, quote, cheater pipes coming into the streams from homes and other inhabited sources? And related to that, to what degree are cheater pipes, absence of residence drain fields, a problem in the watershed? Is there anyone here or anyone in the audience? I don't know the.
They can detect cheater pipes, but to the second question, knowing how many there are out there, there's some.
So the answer is yes, they can detect cheater pipes, the canines, but to what degree they're a problem, we don't know that. We did look to, I mean, if we saw any, you know, when we were doing the stream walks and so on, we didn't see any, I don't think.
It's expensive, but you can do water samples, and for the people here, you can actually do DNA testing, whether it's wildlife or human, because it's been done in a number of places around the state where there's been different kinds of disputes. And, you know, if we're notified as a drain commissioner, we will go out and sample and then test for E. coli and then follow up with the health department. We've done that.
Okay. Another question, if the state of Ohio isn't going to consider Lake Erie as impaired, if the federal government isn't going to consider Lake Erie impaired, how is that going to impact Monroe County's efforts to improve Lake Erie conditions? Also, when urban areas do not think they do things which create a problem, grass clippings into the road, roadway drains. Anybody want to take a start at that?
I will say that the first question is an excellent question. I don't know if I have a response to it that will be satisfying. And maybe you guys can chime in, but I felt like part of the reason Michigan did it was to say, was to step up to try to get maybe Ohio and the feds to do it. If they don't, how would that affect Monroe County? I don't know. I can tell you the river that is impacting western Lake Erie the most is not in Michigan. It's the Maumee. And there are efforts, ongoing intensive efforts, to manage the phosphorus load and solid load from the Maumee now, even without an impairment status from the state of Ohio. Now, that may not be the most satisfying answer, but I think the hope is that impairment status will follow from Ohio and the feds. But I
think EPA has recently been putting more pressure on Ohio.
Well, they have
to go that. Yes, they're requiring more information. I don't know where it's going to lead to, but I know they are putting a little more pressure on Ohio too.
See, I'm in a unique position. I serve with the water quality board with the OEO area governments. I'm also on the MI Clear, Michigan Clear. So I get to kind of see what Ohio's doing, and I get to kind of see what Michigan's doing, because we're kind of caught in the middle. We're in the Toledo economic region, but we're in Michigan. And, I can tell you that Michigan is leaps and bounds ahead of Ohio as far as
The other part of the question was also urban areas do not think they do things which create a problem, grass clippings, et cetera. We do have a part in the watershed management plan to educate the urban residents about that issue in terms of that they do contribute, even if they may not think from the survey results that they have an impact. So we do have sections in there in terms of the key messages to that particular target audience. No mention has been made regarding animal waste from cows, horses, pig farming. Was this aspect taken into the study? Was this aspect included in the study?
Yeah, it was. The only data that we had was, I don't remember how old it was, 1990, 2000, so we had some animal counts.
And there, we looked at, when we were looking at the aerial photos and everything, we looked for that as well as driving around. There's like a llama farm, and that's it. So in this watershed, unless it's manure from an operation, an animal operation outside the watershed, and there's manure coming in and being spread on the cropland, there really isn't animal manure as far as animals in the watershed. It doesn't exist.
Very little livestock left in the road.
Yeah.
Another question, what concerns do you have with grass cutting companies using farmers' fields to dump their grass clippings? Frequently, this highly fertilized urban grass and rural area fields. We didn't talk about that.
We didn't talk about
We didn't
Are they paying the farmers or doing it on the slot?
Is this like composting?
That's what I was
Dumping out the stuff on a compost system?
No, this is Bedford Township. We have a lot of people that like to make their money mowing people's grasses. And we're highly urbanized and they don't know where to take it. So they have farmers who willingly allow them to dump all their grass clippings through the season into their fields.
All right, that's a new one that we had.
that's a new one.
We didn't study that.
We didn't take that into account.
All right, so noted.
Yeah.
Another question regarding buffer strips. More comments. How can we fix that issue in terms of county ordinances, township ordinances, right-of-way laws, easements which prevent destruction of buffer zones already in place, prevent drain cleaning that would damage or remove buffer zones, require a buffer zone for county planning approval by all ditches and drains.
That's more comment than it is.
Okay, more than a question.
Yeah.
Suggestions in terms of how can we, what are some of the things we can do? Go ahead, Dave. There was okay, will SS Lapointe Drain Watershed Management Project include a study of the practice of open lake disposal of Maumee River dredge material and the impact resuspending that material was on the growth of the algal blooms, Western Basin of Lake Erie? Study of the practice of open lake disposal.
So that's a really good question. If I'm not mistaken, the Ohio EPA is coming up, and I can't remember what year it is, 2018, 2019, 2020. They are outlawing the disposal, open water disposal of dredge spoils in Lake Erie. And in fact, it's my understanding it's a contentious issue with the Army Corps, because of course the Army Corps dredges all harbor mouths, and they need a place to put those spoils. So just as a kind of a side note, my company and my office, myself, have a new project we're starting next month where we're going to try to restore the delta at the mouth of the Sandusky River. And that project was initiated as a potential alternative for some of these dredge spoils. So there's more projects planned in Sandusky Bay for the exact same reason. And I think the state is struggling to try to figure out where they're going to put all that material. It's millions of cubic yards in total. But I don't think anyone here would disagree that philosophically it seems like a terrible idea to just dispose of material out into the bay when we're fighting to keep all that sediment.
They're actually dumping it on the state line. They dump it right on the Michigan line. And it, the sediment flows and all that nutrient flows into Michigan.
Yeah, maybe they're accelerating their dumping so that the time.
Yeah, it's horrible. They've been telling me for 30 years that it's a discredited practice and they're going to discontinue it. So you know, if they've litigated, if they've legislated it into law, I'd like to believe it. But it's regulated out of Buffalo, New York, that core district. It's a totally different district than the Detroit district. So what they allow, Detroit would never allow that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In regards to like the dirt and sediment dumping, what about the dumping of the snow removal from the roads and whatnot that they take and just dump into the lake as well, and they don't have a place to go? Should we ever get a big heavy? To me, that should also, I don't know what the impact would be, but still, it's not. I didn't know
The water in the snow's not the problem. It's the salt that may be in the snow. Yeah, due to the icing. And it actually, so I also do some work out west, and you know, out west, salinity is probably the biggest threat to human society. I mean, salinity has killed many human societies over time. Because once you put salt into the ground, it's very hard to get out. And eventually you put so much salt in, you can't grow anything. I think salt is a huge underrated problem. Out here in the Midwest, we're just starting to see these salinities, particularly inland lakes, starting to go up. And the problem is, it's very hard to get salt out of both the earth and out of water once you get it in.
Was that measured at all on your study?
The conductivity is a measure of salt in the water.
Okay.
So it was, in some places it was a little high, in some places it was okay. I mean, it wasn't alarming, but yeah, salinity is a very difficult problem, and it's only going to get worse.
Okay, the last question that we had. Actually, there was another comment on one of the culverts, no open major drains. I don't know if that was a question or comment.
Open drains are an issue, we just won't focus on all of it. Yes, Mr. Johnson, I know you don't want to do that.
You want to pay for it, you do whatever.
Okay.
I tell you that the MPEQ's not
Last question that we received, you might have some more. The Monroe County Road Commission is charged with caring and monitoring the ditches and not doing a real good job with that, lacks direction and oversight. Should this be turned over to MDEQ? How are you going to address that? Monroe County Road Commission?
Ditches and drains are two different entities.
Okay.
The road commission does ditches, but the ditches go to drains, so.
We didn't,
Yeah, we don't have,
we don't-
I wish I had a good answer for you. It's a valid point. And we've done a little bit of work with road commissions, but there's a lot of room for improvement.
well, they are, the government is one of the categories of the target audiences. We have farmers, government, and residents. So we could talk to the Monroe County Road Commission and say this has been raised as part of the project, and so can we, have a conversation and let's talk about this. What? It sounds like you already have.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
When I see a plum ditch and one without a tile, et cetera, so.
Okay.
We don't have time for that. We don't have money, we don't have people, we don't have this, and we don't have that.
Uh-huh.
I said, well, we do have a lot of problems, so.
So it's about prioritizing, yeah, I see, yeah. All right, thank you. Any more questions? I know we're at a few minutes over our closing time, but we are really grateful to all of the presenters who came here tonight, all of you who came, all of those who have been part of this project from the beginning. We're very grateful for that. So please continue to stay informed about this. We will be, if anyone is interested in joining the implementation committee, the implementation group, please let us know. We would be happy. Doug, we'd love to have you. We'd love to have a few more farmers on that committee. I know that it's really busy and it's hard to devote time to this, but we will make it as available as we can to meet the various needs in terms of time and effort. So any other comments, questions? Okay, my last comment is to please take a couple cookies for the road. And thank you for coming and have a safe travel back.